All right, welcome back. In this video, we'll finally write some code involving state inside of a React component. First, a quick recap. We've seen components. So components are the basic building block of React. They combine logic and presentation into a nice, reusable, adorable package. And we've seen props. So props, short for properties, are data that's usually passed down to a component, or sometimes it's just via a default prop, but usually it's passed down. And they are immutable. So a component cannot change its own props. We can't say this dot props dot color equals red inside of the component itself. Now state, as we've already discussed, is internal data specific to a component. It represents that data that can change and usually does change over time. If something doesn't change, then most often you're going to make it a prop rather than state. We'll talk about that later on, but that's the key difference. Props are immutable, state changes over time. So we've talked about state as a general concept, but in React, it's just a instance attribute on a component, and it's called state. So you can't, it's a special name. You can't call it my state or game state or current state. It is called state, and it's a plain old JavaScript object. If you've never seen this acronym, POJO, it's originally plain old Java object is where it comes from, but in our case, it's a JavaScript object. So it's just a bunch of key value pairs inside of an object. And at any point, if you were to print it out like this, console.log this.state from inside of a component. So this would be inside, let's say, a game component. You would see curly braces and key value pairs printed out. So it is just an object. Now there's some magic behind the scenes. It's, React is doing a lot to manage it and help you out, but we'll talk more about that later. So to actually use it, we need to first start by setting an initial state. And you do that as soon as the component is created. Now there's a couple of hoops we have to jump through because we need to do it inside of a constructor function, and there might be some code you're not super familiar with here, so we'll come back to it. But this part is what I want to focus on first. We are setting this.state, it needs to be called state, this.state, to a new object, and we put a single key value pair in there. Num clicks is 0. So this would potentially be something where we're counting clicks called click count, and that will change depending on the number of clicks. So it wouldn't work to do that with props. All right, so let's walk through some of the stuff in the constructor function. So if your component is stateless, which is all the components we have done so far don't have state, period. So they are stateless. You don't need the constructor function. And we talked a little bit about functional components, which are just components you define as a function. If you want to have state, if it's a stateful component, you cannot make it a functional component. You need to use a constructor function, which means you need to define it as a class, which I said right here. If you're building a component with state, you need a standard React constructor. So this is sort of the basic skeleton for your classic React constructor. Constructor takes a single argument, props. If you're not familiar with the way that JavaScript constructors work and the super keyword, in the next video, I'll do a detailed dive into what this line means right here, what super means versus super props. So sometimes you don't actually have to pass that in, but this is standard, basically boilerplate in React. Now there are times you don't have to do this, but that will be saved for the next video. So for now, just assume if you're using state inside of a component, your constructor has to have, it needs to be called constructor, takes an argument props. And at the very beginning, first line, you call super props. And what this does in like 2 seconds is it's going to register your class as a React component. Super is a reference to the constructor of the component. It's calling some code in that constructor and passing props in. Anyway, this is the meat, what we care about in this video. We are setting state. This.state is currently an empty object, but whatever key value pairs we put in there is the initial state. They represent the starting values of the state for this component. And then inside of our methods, we can refer to this.state, just like we've seen this.props. Same sort of idea. So in our render, we could render this.state like we're doing here. Now in this example, which I'll show you in just a moment, nothing is changing. We're just setting the state at the beginning and using it, but we're not actually altering it. So let's test it out. I have a new app here. I just removed almost everything from the app component. And if I made a brand new component here, let's just call it game.js, and I do my standard import React app or import React and component, and then let's do class game extends component. If we're making this a stateful component, we start with a constructor, takes an argument called props, And the first thing we do, as we've discussed, is call super props. Next, we can initialize our state. So this dot state, and once again, this is a very particular name, state. So this is not something that we just arbitrarily decide, make it an object. There is stuff behind the scenes that is working with an object called state. Okay, so then in here, we can add simple values like score and set score to be 25 at the beginning. 0 probably makes more sense. And maybe game over could be false, something like that. Okay, then we can use state, this dot state, and reference it wherever we want inside of instance methods. So for example, render, it's a classic one. And we could simply return, what should we do here? Let's do a div, and inside of that div, let's do an h1 that says your score is, and then this dot state dot score. So far, this is really no different than props, except for the fact that we are initializing it in this constructor, and we are setting the initial values. But we could achieve the same thing of displaying a static score that doesn't change by just setting default props. We'll see shortly how we actually change state, how we set it to be a new value or alter parts of it. So let's just test this out. Export default game. And then in my app.js, I need to make sure that I am importing game. So import game from /game. And then inside of here, let's just render a single game component. Doesn't take any props at the moment. Save. And here we go. Your score is 0. And if we inspect this using the React Dev Tools, you'll see that inside of this game component, we now have state showing up over here. So we have props, which is empty, and we have state, where game over is false and score is 0. So we still haven't seen how to change anything, but we've seen how to set the initial values of our state. So we do it in the constructor at the very beginning, and we make sure we call super props in that constructor. We'll talk about why in the next video, and why sometimes you can do just super. We'll go into it if you care about it, but you can basically take it as a rule of thumb. Always put this at the top of your constructor. And another thing to remember, if you are trying to use state in a component, it cannot be a functional component. We need to have this constructor. And just to show you, if I got rid of this, hopefully this would make sense, that this would cause a problem. There is no state.score. And now we come over here and we get this error message. Cannot read property score of null. So state is null, and it has nothing called score because state is null. Now, if we compare that and we just did this.props.score, you'll see we don't get an error. We don't see anything, but there's not a problem. And what's happening is that props is defined. With state, we got an error saying state is null. There's no state period. That's a key difference. When we're working with props, you don't have to initialize, this object. You don't have to say, okay, here's where we're putting all the props. With state, you do need to set that initial state, and you do that up in the constructor. Okay, so that's all we'll cover in this video. Next will be an optional video talking about super props and what that actually means. And then following that, we'll learn how we change state. It's not as straightforward as you might think, unfortunately, and you'll see why in just a bit.